Sir, I'm going to need you to leave this aircraft now. The words dropped like a hammer. Andre looked up slowly from his seat, adjusting the cuffs of his navy blue suit. Calm, composed eyes, locked on the flight attendant standing over him with folded arms and a frown that could cut glass. "Excuse me," he said, voice low, steady. "I said you need to deboard immediately." Her voice was loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. A hush spread across the rows of passengers. No one said a word. Some shifted uncomfortably. A toddler stopped babbling. Phones didn't come out yet, but everyone felt the tension crackling in the air. "I'm not sure what I've done wrong," Andre replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. "I've been sitting here quietly since boarding." The flight attendant didn't blink. "You've made another passenger feel unsafe. We take these reports seriously." Andre raised a brow. "Unsafe? I haven't even spoken to anyone since I sat down. Please cooperate or I'll have to call security." From row 1 to A, a teenage girl whispered to her mother. "He didn't do anything." Her mother squeezed her hand. "Don't get involved." Andre's chest tightened. This wasn't about rules. This was about something else. Andre leaned forward, voice still calm. "I'd like to know exactly what I'm being accused of." The flight attendant crossed her arms. "You asked a woman to switch seats with you. She felt uncomfortable and reported it." Andre blinked. "That's it. I politely asked if she wanted to switch so I could sit closer to the front. She said you were forceful, intimidating." His brows furrowed. "I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insist. I just asked." The attendant shrugged. "We take all concerns seriously. You'll need to leave." He looked around the cabin, hoping anyone would speak up. The woman in question avoided his gaze, staring at the seatback like it held the secrets of the universe. "This is how it starts," Andre muttered, "with a lie that's easier to believe because of how I look." She didn't respond. A few rows behind, someone whispered, "He didn't do anything wrong." But no one said it aloud. Andre stood slowly, refusing to be rushed. As he reached for his briefcase, the attendant leaned in closer and muttered under her breath, but not quietly enough, "You people always think the rules don't apply to you." He froze. A gasp rippled from a nearby passenger. A man coughed to cover the silence. Somewhere, a phone camera finally clicked on. Andre turned to her, eyes dark with disbelief. "Excuse me, you heard me," she snapped. "You act polite, but you think the world owes you something." Andre took a breath, holding back the rising heat in his chest. "I serve this country every day without asking for anything, and today I asked for a seat, nothing more." She rolled her eyes. "Don't play the victim." From a few rows behind, a college-aged white man shook his head. "That was racist," he whispered to his girlfriend. But his voice didn't rise above a whisper. Andre scanned the rows. Faces turned away. Some looked down, others at their phones. But no one stood up. He nodded slowly. "Now I see it clearly. The injustice wasn't just in the words. It was in the silence that followed." One by one, phones began to rise, not to intervene, but to observe. Passengers became spectators in an all-too-familiar scene of racial discrimination. In public spaces, Andre stood at the center, not as a man, but a moment recorded, streamed, consumed. A young woman near the front looked up from her camera. "This is so wrong," she murmured to herself. "Then say something," Andre said, without turning. His voice didn't waver. She blinked. I don't want to get involved." Others avoided eye contact. Some shook their heads, quietly ashamed, but none spoke. The weight of complicity hung thick in the recycled cabin air. Andre turned slightly, scanning the faces. Every one of you sees what's happening, and every one of you will leave this plane pretending it didn't. A silence louder than shouts answered him. He smiled bitterly. That's how this works. The cameras kept rolling, but no justice came from their lenses. As the murmurs grew, Andre faced the flight attendant one last time. You're making a mistake. A serious one. She didn't flinch. You're free to file a complaint later. Andre's jaw clenched. You don't know who I am, do you? Her smirk deepened. Doesn't matter. You're just another troublemaker, making this harder than it needs to be. He said nothing more. No raised voice. No outburst. Just the quiet burn of a man who had seen this scene play out too many times, in too many ways. But this time, something inside him had shifted. She just didn't see it yet. 2 airport security officers appeared at the entrance of the plane. They didn't say much, just nodded at Andre and gestured toward the aisle. He stepped forward without resistance. Each movement was deliberate, controlled, not because he had to be, but because he refused to give anyone the satisfaction of watching him lose control. The walk down the aisle felt endless. Every stare, every glance carved a piece out of his pride. But he held his head high. Someone whispered, "Why didn't anyone stop this?" No one answered. Andre's grip tightened around his briefcase. This wasn't disgraceful. This was kind that hides fire behind calm eyes. As he reached the front of the plane, a young man with a phone lowered it. Unsure if he should keep filming, Andre paused, turned slightly toward the rows behind him, and with a voice calm as still water, he said, "You'll want to remember this face." It wasn't a threat, it was a promise that the story didn't end here. Because justice real, justice has a way of catching flights to ... and sometimes it arrives when no one expects it. Malcolm Pierce stepped out of his sleek Washington, D.C. townhouse, his polished shoes clicking on the marble steps. The cold morning air didn't touch him. His suit, crisp and tailored, shielded him from the world's bite as he walked toward his waiting car. His briefcase felt heavy in his hand, not from the case files inside, but from the weight of the meetings awaiting him. As the engine hummed to life, he settled into the back seat, staring out the window. Today, like every other, he was headed to the capital. But something felt different today, as if change was already in the air. Malcolm Pierce, Attorney General of the United States, Harvard graduate, a champion of civil rights, with a track record of prosecuting cases that made headlines and shifted the needle of justice. It's a name people recognize, especially in legal circles. He had earned it, fought for it, and now, at 42, he stood at the apex of his career. But no matter the titles or the accolades, he would always remember the night he graduated law school, the people who doubted him, the looks he'd gotten when he first stepped into a courtroom. His rise to the top wasn't just about intelligence or skill, it was about proving them all wrong. Every single step of the way. Malcolm didn't grow up in boardrooms or luxury apartments. He grew up on the block area where the odds were stacked against you from the moment you were born. The streets were familiar, but they were also unforgiving. People were profiled, stopped, and searched for no reason other than the color of their skin. His mother worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on, while his father, a former soldier, struggled to find steady work. Yet from the moment he could read, Malcolm knew what he wanted: a life beyond those streets. It wasn't easy, but he had the will. He climbed, moved up through schools that didn't always see his potential, and he never let go of the dream. And when he finally donned that first suit, his first interview at a firm, it was a victory that proved everyone who underestimated him wrong. From the block to the bench, he'd carved his way, but it wasn't always a smooth ride. Malcolm had faced it all: stares, whispers, and the occasional sideways glance, even in the halls of power. He would walk through the halls of the Senate, dressed in his best, only to be mistaken for a janitor. "Excuse me, can you help me with this?" they would ask, their voices polite, but their assumptions clear, even in federal buildings where he should have been respected for his position. The microaggressions were relentless. "I'll wait for the Attorney General," they'd say, as if they didn't recognize him as the one they had been waiting for. The weight of those assumptions gnawed at him. But Malcolm never let it show. He had no choice but to keep moving forward. The flight to DC was supposed to be simple. Malcolm had a seat in first class, always a quiet respite between the chaos of work and home. He reclined, his head tilted back, eyes closed, already preparing for the meetings ahead. He'd flown 1,000 times before, and nothing about this morning suggested that anything would be different. The flight was calm, the usual hum of the engines in the background. But just as he began to unwind, the abrupt voice of the flight attendant shattered the peace. She was standing next to him, her tone unnervingly firm, and her eyes scanning him as if she'd already made up her mind. As he sat there, the words didn't hit him immediately. They were just noise, something trivial in the grand scheme of everything he'd endured. But it was a noise that brought back every other instance of being watched, scrutinized, and judged. As a kid, it had been the store clerks following him through aisles, clutching their purses tighter. It had been the police cars pulling up behind him on empty streets, lights flashing for no reason at all. And it had been the looks, the ones that told him he didn't belong. These weren't just moments. They were a lifetime, the heavy, invisible baggage of a black man in a world that never forgot who he was, even when he tried to. His thoughts lingered as he looked around at the passengers, some of whom had already begun to glance over, their eyes flickering nervously toward him, waiting for the moment that they too would be forced to react. Malcolm adjusted his seat, intending to make the flight more comfortable for the mother and her young son across the aisle. It was a simple gesture, switching seats so they could sit together. He smiled politely as he stood and began to move toward the empty spot. "Excuse me, ma'am, I was thinking of switching seats with you, just to make it easier for you both." Before he could take another step, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Sir, you can't just roam around up here." He turned to find the flight attendant, Claire, her arms crossed and a tight smile that felt more like a mask than warmth. Her eyes scanned him with quick disdain. "You need to sit back down and wait for the seatbelt sign to turn off." Malcolm's smile faltered, surprised by her tone. "I'm just trying to help," she interrupted him with a glance that said everything. "I said, sit down." He hesitated, but then he lowered his head slightly, nodding in compliance. He had no intention of making waves yet. Claire wasn't just any flight attendant. She carried an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. Her uniform was immaculate, and her smile, though friendly in appearance, never quite reached her eyes. To those who didn't know her, she seemed professional, polite, even. But to Malcolm, there was something sharp beneath the surface. He'd seen people like her before, the ones who wielded small, subtle jabs with a smile, using their position to impose control over others. In her gaze, there was something familiar. The unspoken superiority, the knowing that came with entitlement. It wasn't new to Malcolm. He'd dealt with people like Claire for most of his life. Those who found comfort in enforcing the invisible boundaries of race. "I'll be back with the beverage cart," she said, her tone flat, as if she hadn't just dismissed him entirely. As she walked away, the coldness in her smile lingered. As Malcolm settled back into his seat, he noticed Claire stop by a white passenger seated a few rows ahead. She bent toward him, her voice just loud enough for Malcolm to catch a few words. "If he bothers you at all, just let us know," Claire said, her words veiled in the sweetness of a smile. The subtle implication wasn't lost on Malcolm. She was speaking directly about him, casting suspicion without cause. The passenger, a middle-aged man with a nervous expression, nodded and glanced at Malcolm, as if sizing him up. Malcolm clenched his jaw. It wasn't just her words, it was the unspoken message. In her eyes, he was a threater man who needed to be watched. The man turned back to his seat, seemingly more at ease, and Malcolm's stomach twisted. He wasn't sure what stung more, the warning or the fact that Claire had done it so effortlessly, as if it was nothing. The cart came down the aisle, and Claire's approach was systematic, deliberate. She offered drinks to the passengers in first class, one by one, all while avoiding eye contact with Malcolm. She reached the end of the row, serving everyone, except him. He watched her pour a drink for the man across the aisle, her movements smooth, practiced. She smiled, a picture of civility, yet when she reached Malcolm's seat, her eyes flitted away, not thirsty. She asked a hollow question, hanging in the air. He wasn't sure if he was more confused by the question or the fact that he had been so completely overlooked. "No, I'm fine, thank you." He forced the words out, though they felt empty in his mouth. A few minutes later, the flight attendants passed by again. Malcolm, attempting to brush off the tension, pressed the call button. When Claire approached, her face had hardened slightly, though her voice remained composed. "Yes?" she asked, barely disguising her irritation. "I was wondering if I could get some water." Her eyes flickered to him, then briefly to the others seated nearby, as if weighing the request. "Do you really need anything else?" Her tone was condescending, heavy with a silent challenge. Malcolm opened his mouth to reply, but stopped. Was she baiting him? Or was this just another subtle reminder of where he stood? He simply nodded, the tension in his shoulders mounting. "No, that's all," he said quietly, wondering how many more little battles he'd have to fight today. As the flight continued, Malcolm could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him. Some were curious, glancing quickly as though wondering why he hadn't yet erupted, why he wasn't reacting to the way he'd been treated. Others seemed to take their cue from Clarice, wary, watching from the corner of their vision. He could sense the unspoken judgment hanging over him, the atmosphere thick with discomfort. It wasn't just Claire's treatment, it was the way everyone around him seemed to adopt the same subtle, unspoken rule. Malcolm didn't belong here. He was out of place, an anomaly in a world where his presence, his blackness, seemed to disrupt the carefully curated reality of privilege. The weight of the stairs was suffocating. Some were uncomfortable, unsure of what to do with the situation, while others, perhaps complicit, remained silent, avoiding confrontation. But the tension was palpable, suffocating Malcolm in a way that no one else seemed to notice or care about. As the plane hummed through the sky, Malcolm tried to focus on the view outside the window, but the weight of their eyes, their judgment, was inescapable. Malcolm stood up to stretch his legs, feeling the familiar strain of the long flight. As he walked down the aisle toward the restroom, he barely noticed Claire standing at the front, eyes narrowing as she quickly stepped into his path. "You've been moving around too much," she said, her tone flat and authoritative. It wasn't a question, but an accusation wrapped in official-sounding words. "I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat." Malcolm blinked, confused by her sudden intervention. "I'm just going to the restroom. It's fine." "No." Claire cut him off, her voice sharp. "That's against the policy. You're disrupting the cabin." The passengers around them shifted in their seats, some pretending not to notice, but the tension in the air was thick. The mother in the row behind him had just gotten up to use the restroom, but Claire wasn't stopping her. "Can I speak to a supervisor?" Malcolm asked, trying to maintain his composure. But Claire's icy glare told him he wasn't getting anywhere. "You can sit back down," she said, not moving, "or we'll be forced to take further action." Seconds passed. Claire didn't move, still blocking his path. And then a white passenger, middle-aged and dressed in a suit, passed by. He walked straight past Claire without a second glance, heading toward the same restroom. She didn't stop him, didn't utter a word. Malcolm's heart sank. The contrast was stark. He, a black man, was being targeted for a simple movement. The other man was allowed to move freely with no one questioning him, no one stopping him. The injustice felt suffocating, and Malcolm could feel every eye in the cabin now aware of the scene. Claire's eyes followed the other passenger, and as he disappeared into the restroom, she finally stepped aside. But her words were still sharp, her gaze never wavering from "Malcolm, you're lucky I'm letting you go. Don't make me regret it." As Malcolm turned, relieved but still unnerved, he caught a glimpse of Claire leaning toward one of the male attendants. Her voice was low, but it cut through the air like a dagger. "Keep an eye on him. He's been acting ... odd. Don't trust him." The attendant nodded, glancing over at Malcolm before looking away quickly. Malcolm didn't have to hear the rest to understand the message. A silent betrayal was being set into motion, one that could only end with more discomfort, more shame, and more silence from the other passengers who were too afraid to speak out. The overhead speakers crackled, pulling Malcolm from his thoughts. "Attention. Passengers, we regret to inform you that a situation has arisen. If Malcolm Pierce could please step to the front, we will assist you shortly." Malcolm froze. He wasn't sure if he'd heard it correctly. His name echoed in his mind. His heart started to race. What was happening? The passengers around him started whispering. The unease, the discomfort, it all seemed to be directed at him now. He glanced at the woman across the aisle, who quickly looked away. No one met his eyes, confused but compliant. Malcolm made his way to the front of the plane, every step heavier than the last. Claire was waiting, the same cold expression plastered on her face, like this was all part of a normal, everyday routine. "Mr. Pierce," Claire said, her voice overly polite but brimming with an unsettling authority, "you need to leave the plane. We've received complaints from several passengers that you've been making them uncomfortable. You've caused a disruption." Malcolm's eyes widened. "What? I haven't done anything. I just stood up to use the restroom." "I haven't done." Claire didn't let him finish. "I'm sorry, but you must disembark. You're being removed. For the safety and comfort of the other passengers. I'm following protocol." The room seemed to close in on him. The disbelief, the helplessness, it was suffocating. He looked around for support, but no one met his gaze. His voice trembled as he tried to reason with her. This is a mistake. You're not giving me a chance to explain. There's nothing to explain, Claire interrupted, her voice final, cutting off any hope for dialogue. You're making everyone uncomfortable. It was the ultimate betrayal, one he had seen coming but never wanted to believe. A murmur rippled through the cabin as passengers began to process what was happening. A woman in the back of the plane pulled out her phone, silently recording. Malcolm's eyes met hers for a brief second, but she quickly looked away, her fingers still working the camera. I can't believe this, someone whispered. What did he even do? I don't know, but he's black, another voice responded, barely above a whisper, but loud enough for Malcolm to hear. He stood there, frozen, the weight of those words hanging in the air. It was all too clear now, he was the problem, simply for existing. His stomach churned as he heard the murmurs of doubt and suspicion swelling around him. But not everyone was complicit. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one stood up. No one spoke out. Malcolm took a deep breath, his voice steady but firm. Please, I need to speak to a supervisor. Claire's face hardened. She leaned closer to him, her eyes narrowing. You're being non-compliant, Mr. Pierce. You need to leave, now. The room felt colder as Claire raised her voice, framing him as the one causing a scene. We don't have time for this, she snapped, her tone escalating to one of public reprimand. You're becoming aggressive, and that's not something we can tolerate. Malcolm's chest tightened. The framing was clear. He was the threat, the troublemaker, the one who needed to be controlled, and there was no one to stop it. It wasn't long before the sound of heavy footsteps reached his ears. The cabin door swung open, and 2 uniformed police officers stepped inside, their eyes scanning the crowd before settling on Malcolm. Not a single passenger spoke up. Not one person came to his defense. The silence in the cabin was deafening, more powerful than any words. Malcolm could feel the shame, the weight of being abandoned, seeping into his bones. His hands clenched into fists, not in anger, but in the knowledge that this was a moment of pure injustice. The officers didn't speak to him, didn't ask if he was okay or if he understood what was happening. They simply motioned for him to step off the plane. Malcolm walked down the aisle, his briefcase in hand, but the weight of it felt unbearable. His face wasn't flushed from guilt. It was flushed with the anger of betrayal, anger that no one stood up, that no one cared enough to stop this before it happened. As he stepped off the plane, the door closed behind him, and the last thing he heard before the silence swallowed him whole was Claire's voice, still cold, still distant, calling the next passenger forward. Malcolm stood frozen, trying to absorb the weight of his situation as the TSA officer's voice sliced through the chaos. The officer's eyes widened as they caught sight of his military ID tucked in his jacket. General Pierce, are you okay? Sir, the change was immediate. What had been moments of public humiliation and scorn now transformed into a moment of recognition, of respect. The officer's posture straightened, and a few others nearby took note, their murmurs dying down. Malcolm's head still spun from the abrupt confrontation, but something about being recognized, his title, his status shifted the room's energy. The officer didn't wait for Malcolm to speak. He quickly motioned to others, giving orders in a low but firm voice. Get the general's luggage. Get him out of here. We'll handle this. Malcolm didn't say anything at first. He simply nodded, grateful for the change in tone, but not entirely sure if it was just a new kind of humiliation. They were trying to protect him, but could he still trust any of this? Within minutes, the situation at the airport took on a different Air. As Malcolm was escorted to a private area, phones began to ring in various offices across the airport. From the security station, calls shot through internal channels, reaching higher echelons of power. In Washington, D.C., the connection between federal contacts and airport security officers was immediate. Someone, somewhere, had already heard about the incident, and it was not going unnoticed. The video capturing the chaos, the humiliation, had gone viral. What began as an isolated incident was now a firestorm, burning across social media. The hum of phones grew louder. This wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about a systemic failure that had been broadcast for all to see back at the airlines. Headquarters panic was beginning to set in. The legal team had been contacted by an executive who was growing more agitated by the second. The damage was done. The footage of Malcolm's removal from the plane, the unjust treatment, was already spreading across news outlets and online platforms. It wasn't just about reputation now. It was about legal liability. Public trust was on the line. The airlines' PR team began scrambling, trying to suppress the growing tide of outrage. But it was clear nothing could stop the momentum now. Back at the airport, Claire, still standing at the boarding gate, heard a sudden whisper from one of the flight attendants. It was a name that echoed through the room. Malcolm Pierce. Claire froze. The room around her seemed to pause as the weight of the moment began to sink in. She could feel her pulse quicken, her stomach sinking as the whispers grew louder. She was no longer just an attendant enforcing protocol. The man she had just escorted off the plane, this unknown passenger, was someone far more important than she had ever realized. He's who? Claire's voice trembled, disbelief coating her words. Her hands gripped the counter harder as she scanned the growing buzz around her. The realization that she had just made a grave mistake, publicly humiliating a man of such stature, was starting to settle in. A junior attendant, her hands shaking, approached Claire with a tablet. She displayed Malcolm's profile, his credentials, his awards, his high-ranking military title. General Malcolm Pierce, former advisor to the President, Medal of Honor recipient. Claire's eyes widened, the words barely registering. The profile was undeniable. The man she had dismissed as just another passenger was a decorated high-ranking officer, a national hero. The weight of her actions crushed her. She had no idea who she had just targeted. She had stripped dignity from someone who deserved none. Of it, meanwhile, the video of the incident continued to spread, quickly amassing millions of views. The caption accompanying it screamed injustice, and soon the viral outrage was overwhelming. People who had never heard of Malcolm Pierce now rallied behind him, expressing their disbelief and anger over what had happened. From the airport terminals to people watching at home, the public was waking up to the truth. The story was no longer just about a TSA conflict. It was about the systemic racism that still pervaded everyday life. And people weren't standing for it anymore. The fire of outrage had been ignited, and there was no stopping it. It wasn't long before an airline manager appeared, visibly red-faced, trying to put together an apology. He stammered, not quite sure how to apologize for what had just occurred. Mr. Pierce, I can't begin to express how sorry we are for what happened today. But Malcolm's response was quiet, composed. Your apology means little. The damage is done. The manager fumbled with his words, trying to convey regret, but Malcolm remained silent. His calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaotic moment just hours before. The apology wasn't enough to heal the wounds of public humiliation, and Malcolm knew that. But it wasn't the apology that mattered, it was what came next. Malcolm looked directly at the manager, his voice steady, but the power of his words resonated. Apologies are good, but accountability is better. The room grew still, and for a moment everyone felt the weight of his words. Malcolm wasn't looking for pity or sympathy. He wasn't asking for apologies. He was asking for something much more important: justice. And justice would be served, whether they liked it or not. By morning, the video had exploded across the internet. Headlines screamed of the humiliation Malcolm endured, while viral clips played across every social media platform. Millions of people, from ordinary citizens to prominent figures, expressed their outrage. The hashtags Justice for Malcolm and #racial bias tragedy trended. It wasn't just a video anymore. It was a movement. Comments flooded in. This can't go on. We're done staying silent. We demand change. The collective roar of the public began to drown out the silence that had protected the system. The world was awake, and it was angry. News vans began pulling up at the terminal within hours, their logos shining under the harsh airport lights. Journalists, cameras raised, rushed in with microphones, their cameras catching every moment. The quiet, orderly chaos of the airport now felt different. Every corner, once a place of mundane hustle, now buzzed with the tension of an unfolding public reckoning. It wasn't just a news story anymore, it was the story. National reporters interviewed passengers, crew members, and officials as the terminal morphed into a stage for the world to see the truth unfold. Hours later, the CEO of the airline issued a statement, carefully crafted apology designed for the public eye. "We deeply regret the unfortunate events that transpired," the spokesperson began, their voice devoid of warmth, almost mechanical. "We are committed to conducting a full review of the incident and ensuring this never happens again." But it was too late. The damage was done. People were no longer interested in the words of an executive behind a polished desk. Trust had evaporated, and no apology could fill that hollow space. Inside the airline's corporate headquarters, Claire sat in the HR office, her eyes darting nervously. She had been officially suspended pending investigation. The cold, sterile nature of her surroundings felt like a mirror to the fear creeping into her chest. This wasn't the quiet dismissal she had expected. This was a reckoning one she had no control over. Word had already spread through the company that a formal investigation was underway. Her face paled as the full weight of what she had done began to set in. Meanwhile, behind the closed doors of the airline's boardrooms, panic shifted into action. They had no choice now but to address the root of the problem. The public's fury was too loud to ignore, and so the airline, for the first time, began revising its internal training protocols. Diversity and bias workshops were suddenly on the agenda, and new guidelines for handling passengers were being rewritten. The systemic change had started, but it wasn't going to come overnight. For now, it was a temporary fix, a response to a crisis, but it was a step in the right direction. The question was, how far would they go? Malcolm sat in front of a television camera later that afternoon, dressed in a crisp suit, his expression composed yet filled with quiet strength. The anchor asked him how he felt about the viral response, but his eyes held something deeper, something that resonated with the millions watching. His voice was calm but forceful, a direct contrast to the anger that had driven the moment. "It's not about me," he said, his words cutting through the noise. "This is about a system that's been broken for too long." The camera lingered on his face, as his words settled in the hearts of viewers, not just in the studio, but across the nation. In the midst of the interview, Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but powerful as he framed the issue. For everyone watching, what happened to me wasn't just a mistake or a misunderstanding. It's about assumptions, he said, his gaze unwavering. We're so quick to judge based on the color of someone's skin, the position they hold, or how they look. It's a pattern that goes deep into how we interact with each other every single day. His words lingered in the air, resonating not just with the viewers, but with the young activists and students who were beginning to form a movement around his words. Within hours of Malcolm's televised speech, university students and grassroots organizations began organizing protests. Chants filled the streets, echoing in cities from coast to coast, "No justice, no peace." Social media was awash with calls for change. It was a ripple that had started with one incident, but was quickly becoming a nationwide wave of solidarity. Malcolm's quiet dignity had sparked a fire, and now people from all walks of life were standing up in unity, demanding more than just apologies. They were demanding systemic change. Lawmakers took notice. In the weeks that followed, a bill was introduced to Congress, the Passenger Rights Anti-Discrimination Act. This legislation would seek to eliminate racial profiling and ensure that no passenger would ever again be subjected to the kind of treatment Malcolm had endured. The bill was a direct response to the incident, a tangible piece of change born out of the viral outrage. The ripple had moved from social media to the floors of the Capitol, and now it had the potential to make real, lasting change. Malcolm walked back into his courtroom, not just as a state attorney, but as a symbol of resilience, of justice, of standing up when the system tries to silence you. His colleagues noticed the change. He wasn't the same man who had walked out the day before. He was something greater now, a representation of truth and integrity. The world had been watching, and now the world knew Malcolm's fight for justice had only just begun. He stood taller, not just in stature, but in spirit, and he was ready for whatever came next. Think back. Have you ever seen someone being treated unfairly, but stayed quiet, hoping it would pass? We all have those moments, the uncomfortable silence that fills the space when injustice happens right before us. That feeling of wanting to speak up, but somehow holding back. It's a moment that's haunting, because staying silent in the face of wrong can make us just as complicit. Now, imagine if you were in Malcolm's shoes, standing in that airport, fighting not just for yourself, but for everyone who's ever been wronged by assumptions and bias. What would you have done at that moment? Would you have spoken up, or would you have remained silent, unsure of the consequences? What kind of person do you want to be when injustice knocks at your door? This story isn't just about Malcolm, it's about all of us. It's about how we stand up, how we choose to make our voices heard. Let's start the conversation. Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit that like button, and share if this resonates with you. And don't forget to subscribe, because the more of us who speak out, the more we can change. Your voice matters.